Not a slow August news day for the White House. President Obama gives Bernanke the nod for another term, and the White House raises its forecast for that deficit we were talking about next year, expected to be $1.5 trillion now, 19% more than previously expected. White House economic advisor Jared Bernstein is at the White House to help us break down the news. Jared, welcome back to the show. I got to start by asking, cutting down your growth expectations and boosting your deficit expectations, is this going to hamper your goal of cutting the deficit in half in the first term?
I don't think so, in the sense that when we revisit the policies that we need to implement to cut the deficit significantly over our first term, that's going to be part of our FY11 budget. Now, one of the things that I think you can take heart is that the fiscal stimulus was conceived as essentially a two-year plan. We're going and we're on track to spend out 70% by about a year from now, by next summer. So as that comes down, its pressure on the deficit comes down as well. By the way, I wanted to correct something. Actually, in today's mid-session review, we brought down the deficit level for this year from $1.7 trillion to $1.5 trillion.
Oh, but Jared, we're talking about 2010 here.
Yes, so in the out years, starting next year, I wanted to be very clear, yes, we're looking at bigger budget deficits, and you teed it up exactly right. We're facing, obviously, a very tough economy. That means more spending and less revenue.
All right, so Jared, how do we rein this in? We know it's going to be an anemic economy. We're looking at these, more than $1 trillion deficits for several years here. I mean, how specifically do you rein it in? A lot of folks say to me, I'm worried because the president and his advisors don't really have a plan in place.
I got three words for you: health care reform. Over the longer term, you simply cannot rein in the unsustainable trends in our fiscal situation without reforming the health care system, without bending that cost curve. Now, by the way, I'm talking about this because we're talking about, in the context of fiscal policy. You could say the same thing in the private sector. Whether you're a family, whether you're a business, you are looking out years at an unsustainable burden from health care, and there's simply no way around it. You have to go through health care reform if you're going to get these trends where they need to get in terms of sustainability.
You know what, Jared, pretty much everyone we speak to agrees with you that we need health care reform desperately.
Good.
Both on the fiscal side and because of, I guess, the moral problem that we face in this country with not everyone having access to health insurance. The problem is almost no one agrees with the White House on the way you're going about health care reform. Do you think it's time to maybe go back to the drawing board here?
No, I think that's an overstatement. I think there's a much more broader agreement than that on the guts of health care reform. Not to say that we're not, obviously we're having very vigorous debates about the structure, but I'm glad to hear you say, and I think you're correct, that it's widely agreed upon that reform is necessary. And you mentioned the fiscal case and the moral case. There's a very strong economic case. The burden to the overall economy of going from 17% of GDP, which is health care right now, to 30% of GDP, which is healthcare 20 years from now, if we don't get off this unsustainable trend, that's going to squeeze out much too much economic growth otherwise.
Jared, I'm also though worried about the growth prospects. You guys also just reduced your GDP growth for next year to 2%, less than the 3.2% you expected back in May. I mean, so everybody's kind of ratcheting down these growth estimates. Right. Where, though, will the growth come from? Because growth is a key part of also reducing the deficit and getting the overall economy back on track.
That's a great question, Carol. In the short run, I think listeners will be interested to recognize that growth is coming from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Independent analysts have argued, and I can count 3 or 4 of them, not just us, Goldman Sachs, the Economic Policy Institute, Mark Zandi.
Right, but what happens when that stimulus goes away, Jared? I get it. I understand how the stimulus, you pump it in, it works.
That contributes to short-term growth.
What happens, though, afterward? Where's the growth really going to come from? People are worried about consumers not really spending, saving more. Where does the growth come? I mean, our economy is kind of going through a transformation here, so where does the future growth come from?
Well, if you think about the components of gross domestic product, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, we know that consumers are deleveraging. So that's going to be a tough lift. Now, as the job market begins to come back, and we are not there yet, wages and earnings will help to turn some of that around. So at some point, the deleveraging gets to be less of a drag on consumption. But I think that businesses, you actually saw a little bit of this come out in the cash for clunkers. Businesses have underinvested for so long. You can convince yourself, I think, pretty easily that they've overshot on the disinvestment side. So I think we'll see something there. We know about government spending. We talked about that.
Right.
And then net export. Net exports are also going to be an important area moving forward.
Jared, forgive us. We got to take this commercial break. Thank you so much, though. White House economic advisor Jared Bernstein.